So when we look at decisions that we're making around either audiences or investments, I think at the end of the day, we have to keep in mind that we're talking about these brands because we desire to drive some outcomes, and those outcomes are always business related. And whether you seek those outcomes in the immediate future, or whether you're talking about building brand equity that translates into better business outcomes in the future, it's all about getting either sales or some form of business outcome that you want. And for too long, I think in the industry, we've used proxies just because of our inability to measure the outcome. And I'd say that advertising has had a problem that broadband has had for a long time, and that broadband still has in a lot of developing markets, which is called the problem of the last mile. You bring the wire all the way up till the house, and then it's not in the apartment. And that's the same thing which I think we've faced for quite some time. And I think it's important to stress this, which is we do have an addiction to measuring proxies because there are benchmarks which have been developed over the years. And there are really a fair amount of clients who I must credit with making the move and saying that it's important for us to go beyond proxies. Now the challenge is that it's not consistent, it's not scalable because you don't have the same level of sophistication or data in different markets. So if you look at it from a global lens, it's still proxies that largely drive the decisions behind advertising. It shouldn't be that way, and I think it's an industry-wide issue that we should address. But I think that the idea of measuring a cost per proxy in order to figure out whether you'll get to a business outcome, I don't think those relationships that used to exist 20, 30 years ago exist in the same fashion today. I think it's very much possible that your cost per whatever proxy you're using is going up, and yet you're getting the business outcome that you want. And so I would say that we'll get there. It's a matter of timing. It's rather a question of when rather than if. I think anybody who's not planning towards business outcomes is doing a disservice to their clients. When we talk about data, there's a fair amount of generalization that we do when we talk about use cases. And then there is also an assumption that many of these data sets are standardized, that they're all tagged and classified in the same fashion. In other words, when I call an audience a fashion-focused audience, and when you call an audience a fashion-focused audience, the underlying definitions behind both those segments are one and the same, which is not the case. So there are a few people who have access to really large data sets, and they do not need to model that out further. So the Googles and the Facebooks of the world are very much in the deterministic space. And the logic there is that there's a fair amount of rigor and understanding behind who these audiences are. And when you're talking about probabilities, you are modeling it out, and there's a little bit of an error that exists. Again, I'm less convinced on the debate itself. What I'd rather look at is the integrity of the data that's being collected, and an understanding of how it's being classified, and what actually does rest in that data set, when was it last refreshed, etc. And I think it's pretty easy to make out whether a data set is valid or not. But I think that is the rigor that we need to follow. The probabilistic versus deterministic is because it's a probability. There is a fair chance that sometimes these segments are not going to work because they do not accurately represent who you're seeking to target. So I think that there is a fair amount of concern from clients about how their data is collected, how it is managed, and whether we are compliant with regulations across different geographies. And the reason for that, very simply, is that there's a fair amount of attention from governments around the world around this topic. So not paying attention to it could seriously get you into issues. The other part of this is I think there's a much better understanding and education that's happened with consumers who are concerned about what's the data that's getting collected, how is it being used, and what is the value that I'm getting in exchange. And that concern expresses itself in many different ways, because consumers, as you know, are not seeking to be targeted. I think, it's interesting. When you talk to millennials especially, they're quite conscious and quite aware of when they're being retargeted. They can spot things like, I went to a particular website and then I go somewhere else and I'm being fed a certain message again and again and I'm sick and fed up of it. And so there's a greater awareness of that, and that translates into a greater expectation of responsibility on the part of these brands. So there is the legal aspect to it, and then there's the consumer aspect to it. And so one of the things we always tell our clients is two things. First, we've got to make sure that we've ticked all the boxes, whether it comes to the GDPR in Europe. And it's ironic because it's going in a direction which is very different from where the US market is headed, where there seems to be a lot more freedom with what you can do with the data as opposed to in the EU, where their regulations are a lot more stricter. And then the second element of that is the consumer bit, where we are asking our clients to be a little bit more conscious about, rather than bombarding consumers with messages which they may not appreciate, what's the value exchange? What are you giving them in return? And the answer really is either it's in a great experience or it's in a great product offer which they cannot get otherwise. And if that exchange isn't there, then I think even if you meet all the legal requirements, you don't really get any traction with consumers. Well, I do agree that the whole planning and buying cycle has changed completely from what it was before. So in the past, you had an almost linear flow. I still do think that parts of the business are linear in nature. The traditional TV setup is still quite linear. It shouldn't be, but it still is. I do, however, feel that there is a greater acknowledgement of what's actually taking place in the market, feeding that back into either changing the strategy or looking at your audience segments differently. And then there are different data sets that play into this, whether it's purchase data, whether it's data that's coming in from social. I think brands are a lot more agile in how they respond to what the market's doing. But while there's a lot of freedom and flexibility around certain elements of this, there is still a lot of structure around some of these processes which have not yet changed. Part of that is legacy, part of that is human behavior, and part of that is systems which have not kept pace with what's happened in the rest of the digital ecosystem. So very simply put, you almost have a spaghetti bowl in the digital ecosystem where you can make your way through planning, buying, and measuring how many ever times you want. Whereas it's not that complex yet in the traditional ecosystem. Once you've sent out a booking and once you've actually activated, it still does take a fair amount of time for you to make changes.